I'm going to give an overview of behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. So when we think about FTD and how common it is the third most common neurodegenerative dementia. So that means that of all the progressive causes of dementia, it's the third one. The first one is Alzheimer's disease, then there's Lewy body disease, and then frontotemporal degeneration. FTD accounts for about 15% of all dementias. And in those who have symptoms beginning before the age of 65, it's at least as common, if not more common, to have FTD as the cause of the dementia instead of Alzheimer's disease. So we consider FTD to be the most common early onset dementia. It is a rare disease, however, so fewer than 200,000 people are thought to have FTD living in the United States. And overall, I'll talk a little bit more about how things change over time. It's generally thought to have a little bit of a faster course than Alzheimer's disease, a 7 to 10 year course, but that can be very variable. Also a little different from Alzheimer's disease is that there is a larger proportion of people who may have a gene change as the cause of their FTD. And again, I will talk a little bit more about this towards the end. So when we think about frontotemporal degeneration disorders, we have the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia. We have the language variants, which are also called primary progressive aphasia, or PPA. And then there are two other disorders which have more motor symptoms: progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP, and cortical basal syndrome, which can be referred to as CBS or also CBD. So all of these disorders fall under the umbrella of frontotemporal degeneration disorders, but today we'll be focusing on behavioral variant FTD, and that accounts for about 50% of FTD disorders. When we think about the symptoms of BVFTD, a lot of times we think about disinhibition. So being very impulsive or having socially inappropriate behavior. So this could include reckless driving, seeing something delicious on somebody else's plate and taking that to eat yourself, making some rude comments out loud instead of keeping them inside. There can also, in contrast, be apathy. So instead of these sort of outward behaviors, just kind of going into the self, losing interest, losing drive, losing motivation. So it seems like the person might just kind of hang out on the couch all day or drop all the hobbies that they used to be very invested in. What can be most difficult is that there can be a loss of sympathy or empathy. So not caring about the feelings or experiences of others. A family member may receive a cancer diagnosis and it seems like it's just brushed off. Or a grandchild might be injured and instead of going to console the child, the person may laugh. And this part can be the most puzzling and also the most heartbreaking for people around the individual with FTD. There can also be these repetitive or compulsive or ritualistic behaviors. So this could be not just lining up trash cans, your own trash cans in a very precise way, but perhaps even going around the neighborhood and lining up everybody's trash cans in a very precise way. Perhaps there is a very strict daily schedule which can't be disrupted even in an emergency. At 10 o'clock, 3 blueberries need to be eaten, some very specific schedules, or Saturday is always the day for laundry and you can't do it on Sunday. Sometimes these repetitive behaviors can be manifest in language, sort of saying the same stock phrase every time, even if it maybe doesn't completely apply. There can be dietary changes as well. And this would be, again, if it is a significant change from what the person preferred before. So maybe there is a new sweet tooth and almost binging on large amounts of sweets. Or maybe somebody suddenly begins chain smoking, and they have never been a smoker before. And then there can be what we call executive dysfunction. So this is the brain's ability to plan and problem solve and then juggle and manipulate information. So this may involve, for example, problems with putting together a whole trip, which probably we would all like to do these days. But how to figure out um, where the parking lot is near the airport, how to pack appropriately for the trip, and then how to set up the hotels and where to do that. All of that planning can be very difficult. If there is a change in the plan, it could be hard to problem solve, to adjust midstream. And it could also be hard to juggle between tasks. So if you're in the middle of looking at what you're cooking and the telephone rings, it's just hard to interrupt and then go back to what you're doing. So in terms of thinking about the diagnosis of FTD, where we start is with hearing about um, this these symptoms, and most specifically, you'll be asked, well, how is this a change from how things were before? And so a lot of the initial visit to the doctor would be to hear from the person who's experiencing these symptoms and from people who know them very well to learn about when things started changing, how they have changed or not over time, and again, most specifically, how this is different from how things were before. There will often be some cognitive testing and a neurologic exam, but another part of the history taking is reviewing whether there could be other causes of these symptoms. So doing a careful review of all of the medication to see if there could be some side effects of medications causing these symptoms, screening to see if maybe there are other drugs being used that could cause these symptoms. Also learning about whether there may instead be a psychiatric disorder, a sleep disorder, or a seizure disorder causing these symptoms. And also looking for other medical conditions which could be contributing, such as the undiagnosed thyroid disease or undiagnosed uncontrolled diabetes. We also do think about whether, for example, there could be a brain tumor that is pressing on a part of the brain and causing these symptoms. And so the workup looks at ruling out these other causes of symptoms. So there may be additional tests beyond that first doctor's visit. And one additional test could be neuropsychological testing, which is typically several hours of paper and pencil testing to get a full cognitive profile of where the person's strengths are and where there are vulnerabilities. And it's looking at how the pattern might support a diagnosis of BVFTD. A tricky part there is that we don't have a lot of good tests, and especially standardized tests, to capture or interrogate those social emotional changes. So sometimes the cognitive testing can look quite normal, especially early on. And that is where the clinicians rely quite heavily on people who know this person to tell them, again, what has changed and how this is different from how it was before. Because changes can go both ways. Sometimes someone who used to be very outgoing now is not outgoing, and then there can be the opposite, where somebody who used to be very much keep to themselves is now going up to strangers. So a change either way could raise the question of whether the changes are due to BVFTD. So then we think about getting brain scans. Usually we think about a structural scan, so a scan to look at the structure of the brain, and the MRI gives us the most detail of the brain structure, and I will show you some of these scans in the next slide. Sometimes we also pursue a functional brain scan, and typically this would be a FDG PET scan. So this is to look at the metabolism of the brain cells. Sometimes a lumbar puncture or spinal tap is also considered, and that is to rule out other causes of these changes. For example, the lumbar puncture can look to see whether there may be an infection present, and there are other things we can look at in the spinal tap fluid, which I will talk about in a few slides. But another very important part of the diagnostic procedures is actually continuing to see this person over time. Because if someone has BVFTD, we think that this person then would continue to experience progressive changes over time, progressive decline. Again, the pace may be different for different people, but we would expect that there would be decline over time. And so that's another important part of the diagnosis. Now I'll just talk a little bit about brain anatomy, and when we're talking about frontotemporal dementia, why we use these words. So this is a picture of a brain, and the brain, when we think about the brain, we think about different parts of the brain, different lobes of the brain. So this brain, the front of the brain is at the left side of the screen. So not very creatively, that part of the brain is called the frontal lobe. A little further back from that is the parietal lobe. At the very back of the brain is the occipital lobe. And then sort of beneath the ears is the part of the brain we call the temporal lobe. So frontotemporal dementia refers to the two lobes of the brain, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, which are most affected by the disease process. So when we get a brain scan, we are looking for changes within the frontal and temporal lobes to help confirm the suspicions that the symptoms the person that we've been hearing about are indeed due to degenerative changes in the brain. So here are brain MRIs. On the top row is brain MRIs of normal brain structure. On the bottom are brain MRIs of an individual with atrophy or shrinkage of the frontal lobes. So just to orient you, the column on the left is an axial slice or a horizontal slice through the brain. So the orientation here is that the front of the brain is at 12 o'clock. So the frontal lobe is up here and the back of the brain is at 6 o'clock. The orientation on the right is a slice right through the center of the head. And perhaps you can see here, here's the nose, so the person is looking off to the left. And so right above the nose, this is again the front of the brain, these are the frontal lobes. So again, this is on the top is the normal structure of the brain. And on the bottom, this is someone who has degeneration of the frontal lobe, atrophy of the frontal lobe, shrinkage of the frontal lobe. So you can see here that the front part of the brain, the brain tissue is, as I was mentioning, very shrunken as compared to the back of the brain. The darkness here, these are the fluid-filled spaces. And so as the brain is gradually shrinking, the space is getting larger, so we're seeing more of that darkness. Similarly, these internal spaces, the ventricles of the brain where that fluid is made, these areas, especially in the front, are enlarged as well, especially as compared to this normal structure. We can also see that from the side, that this, the front part of the brain here, there has been shrinkage of the brain tissue as compared to the back of the brain. There's relative preservation of the brain tissue at the back. So on the MRI scan, or sometimes it's a CT scan, so on the structural scan of the brain, we are looking to see whether there is shrinkage in areas of the brain, the frontal and temporal lobes, which would support a diagnosis of FTD. And we're also looking to rule out other causes, other changes that can happen in the frontal temporal lobes, such as ruling out a brain tumor, ruling out a stroke, ruling out changes that we can see from multiple sclerosis. So this is looking at the structure of the brain. We also can get a different type of scan called an FDG PET scan to look at the brain metabolism. So again, on the top is a scan of normal brain metabolism. On the bottom is what we would see when there is frontal lobe hypometabolism. So this is actually a type of CAT scan, but there is a dye used, which is a radioactive dye with a little bit of sugar, because healthy brain tissues need a lot of energy or consume a lot of energy as they're working. And so the brain cells will take up this tagged sugar dye, and it lights up in the scanner. And so we're looking to see if the brain tissue is metabolizing the sugar as usual, or if there are areas of the brain which are not metabolizing in a normal way. So again, the orientation here on the left is a horizontal slice through the brain. You can see how it looks a bit fuzzy. Here we're not really looking at the structure, we're looking at that metabolism functioning. And so in a normal, healthy brain metabolism, you would see a lot of uptake, a lot of activity all around the edge of the brain, the part of the brain we call the cortex. Whereas in FTD, there is low metabolism, hypometabolism, specifically in the front part of the brain. Again, the back part of the brain still looks quite healthy. On the right side is a midline slice through the head. Again, we see normal metabolism throughout, from the front to the back, whereas in FTD, we are seeing low or hypometabolism really in that front part. So we look with imaging to see if we see degenerative changes, which would confirm FTD as a cause of these symptoms, either through the structural change, the shrinkage, or through the functional low metabolism, hypometabolism. So if we see these changes, that helps us be more confident about this diagnosis, but it still doesn't tell us what exactly is going on in the tissue. And this remains something that we still can't say definitively in the clinic. These neurodegenerative diseases are due to protein tangles, and there are different types of proteins that get tangled up and accumulate in and sometimes around brain cells, and thus cause the brain cells to not work as well, and then to gradually become less effective at the metabolism, and then eventually to die off. And that's when we see the atrophy or shrinkage. So the specific protein tangles of FTD, which are only visible right now if under a microscope. So it's only visible by taking a piece of brain tissue and putting specific stains on it to identify whether there are tau tangles or accumulations of a different type of protein tangle called TDP43. So behavioral variant FTD, the most common underlying neuropathologic changes are either due to accumulations of tau or accumulations of TDP43. But right now in the clinic, we don't have a way to distinguish whether somebody has FTD tau or FTD TDP43. I had mentioned there are some additional tests, for example, the spinal tap or lumbar puncture. And in the lumbar puncture, since this is accessing the fluid that the brain makes, we can measure some of the proteins that accumulate in the brain tissue. However, right now, we can only look for the protein profile of Alzheimer's disease. We can't look for or measure these, we can't detect the tau or TDP43 proteins in the spinal fluid right now. So a lumbar puncture, though, can be helpful to determine whether Alzheimer's disease neuropathology is present or not. And if it turns out that we see the protein profile of Alzheimer's disease, we may in fact say this seems to be frontal variant Alzheimer's disease, not frontotemporal degeneration. Along these lines, there is another type of PET scan. I put it here because you may have heard about something called an amyloid PET scan. At the moment, it is available and approved by the FDA, but it's not covered by insurance. So we don't usually obtain this type of scan in the clinic because it remains very expensive. But that type of PET scan, it tags the amyloid protein of Alzheimer's disease, so can answer a similar question that we look for in the spinal fluid of, is the degenerative change due to Alzheimer's disease? So once we get to a point where we think about a diagnosis, of course, then we say, well, what's next? What do we expect going forward? And that also remains a difficult question to answer. It can be quite variable. Each person's journey, as I'm sure you'll hear over the next several hours, can be quite different. So while we think of BVFTD, starting with changes in behavior, social behavior, and the planning and executive functioning, over time, there can also be changes in language abilities, and sometimes there can be changes in memory as well. And there can also be motor changes as well, depending on where the changes are happening in the brain. So there sometimes can be coordination problems, there can be slowness or stiffness, there can be changes in walking, sometimes there can be precipitous falls, there can be changes in eye movements, and sometimes swallowing can be affected. Sometimes movement changes can actually be a form of ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. Another way of referring to that is motor neuron disease. And if that happens, we think of this as FTD ALS or FTD motor neuron disease. And the symptoms of ALS are muscle weakness, muscle wasting. That can happen in the arms or legs, but it can also happen in the throat. And so the voice can change and become nasal. So different things can happen over time, which is another important reason to keep performing clinical evaluations to see if any of these changes are happening and to adjust accordingly. Now, the numbers can sometimes be a bit daunting to say, well, survival is 2 to 20 years after diagnosis. I mean, that's just a huge, almost not helpful range. We think about, okay, the average may be 7 to 8 years, but part of that depends on how early in the course a diagnosis is made. And it also can depend on which symptoms Um, Unfortunately, the ALS part of the disease can be very rapid, and so that would be on the shorter end of the spectrum. So in the next slide, I just put up some examples of different, these are just sort of hypothetical ways that things can change over time. Also partly to illustrate that sometimes people can start with language changes and then after a few years can develop behavioral changes. So someone, again, may start with BVFTD symptoms, and then after a few years, it's noted that they're becoming Parkinsonian. It doesn't mean that they have Parkinson's disease, but that they have symptoms that look like Parkinson's disease. And so there can be stiffness or a shuffling gait. Sometimes people can start with language changes after many years develop behavioral changes. Sometimes there can be these precipitous falls. Sometimes someone can have behavioral changes and through the whole course of the disease, that is all that happens. There are no additional significant language changes or motor changes. At the bottom here is if ALS were to be involved, that would be a much shorter course. What can also sometimes shorten the course is the nature of the behavioral changes. I had mentioned that there can be impulsivity. And so sometimes, for example, if somebody is eating very rapidly, there could be a choking spell. So the person may still be very active and engaged, but because of a behavioral issue, the disease course may be very quickly shortened because of a specific risky behavior. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is no disease-modifying medication. By that, we look for things that can slow the course of the disease, that can stop it in its tracks, or potentially reverse the changes that have happened. So for BVFTD, right now, there is no such medication. However, for ALS, there are two medications. So that's important to keep in mind if there are motor neuron disease symptoms, that there are medications that could be considered to lengthen the lifespan. We do think about symptomatic medications, though. Even though there's no specific medicine that's proven to be the best one, we think about using antidepressants or mood stabilizers, especially selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors can be very helpful for reducing some of the compulsions. Sometimes we think about using antipsychotics. There could be a question of whether stimulants could be useful, but there are side effects we have to be careful about with stimulants. And we typically avoid using Alzheimer's medications. It is very important to reduce the number of medications needed to reduce the number of side effects and interactions. And there have been studies showing that medications for Alzheimer's disease, such as donepezil or memantine, may worsen some of the behavioral symptoms, for example. And so that's partly why we look to see, can we be as sure as possible that the BVFTD syndrome is due to frontotemporal degeneration, as opposed to frontal variant Alzheimer's disease. There's also plenty of non-pharmacologic treatments, and I think you'll hear more about that today, but I just wanted to bring up some strategies to think about, and some of this I've learned from you in the audience. So in terms of compensatory strategies for tricky behavioral issues, it can be helpful to think about how to give back some household responsibilities to maintain that sense of belonging and being a productive member of the household. Sometimes it can help to take a task and break it down into manageable steps. So the laundry as a whole could be very daunting, but how do we break it down into, sorting out the whites and the colored materials, and then putting the detergent in, break it down into each step. Sometimes it can even be helpful to have an activity template. So for example, even with toothbrushing, the steps and the order of the steps, there can be little pictures of, right by the sink to cue the person, where are you right now and what's the next step. And there can also be a daily schedule that's readily available to look for, what is the activity of the day, what are the chores to be accomplished for the day. These routines can be so helpful, and sometimes it can actually be helpful to have somebody who is not a family member providing the prompting to do a certain task. Sometimes that nudge is better received if it's from a non-family member. Sometimes it's the opposite, but worth exploring. But certainly having a structured environment can be very beneficial. So knowing what the plan for the day is. If it's hard to organize things, it can be helpful to have that structure provided. And this is also where, when it's available, having a day program can be a wonderful way to spend the day, for example. Other things to consider are roaming. There can be a lot of these pacing, this compulsive, this need and want to get out and about and to go on certain routes. If that's happening, and even regardless of that, it's very helpful to think about having a bracelet. This is like taking that umbrella along. If something were to happen, on the bracelet should be some explanation of thinking changes and who the contact is for an emergency. Certainly this would be also a place to include any medication allergies. So this is, in the case of an emergency, how somebody could help and also be aware that there are thinking changes. Pocket cards can also be helpful if they're when we're able to socialize with others, if there are behaviors which others might find intrusive. There can be pocket cards which can help break the ice, explaining the reasons for the behavior and hopefully decreasing anxiety around it. But again, sometimes the routines, even where the person likes to walk around, that can be very helpful to know what would be going on at a certain time of the day. As long as it's not creating a danger to the person or others, then it's often a very helpful way to know where the person might be at a certain time of day. In terms of communication strategies, it's often very helpful just to slow everything down. It gives everybody more time to think of the words they want to say, to organize thoughts, and also to process what's being said. So just giving that processing time more time to elapse. Also eliminating distractors, so that there's no switching between different stimuli. So one-on-one conversation is typically better, and not having any background noise, not having the TV on in the background. Sometimes it can be helpful to provide prompts instead of asking an open-ended question, what do you want to do today? Thinking together, should we go to the park or should we go to the zoo? Giving a couple choices. Sometimes yes/no questions can be helpful, although caution there that sometimes you have to give enough time to make sure the correct yes or no response has been selected. And also using gestures and visual aids if that's helpful. Would you like to go to the zoo, and have a brochure of the zoo right there. Additional interventions over time that we think about, cognitive rehabilitation, often done through a speech therapist, which is not just confined to speech therapy, but the speech therapist can help with coming up with a good routine, adjusting the routine as time goes on. Physical and occupational therapy can be helpful. Sometimes there can be home visits to make sure that everything is safe to prevent falls. There's a technique called Lee Silverman voice therapy, which can help if people have a Parkinsonism trait of a low volume voice. This can help with projecting the voice. And then to keep in mind that there may be a need for a swallow evaluation if there are concerns for difficulties and to be able to adjust the diet appropriately. I'll talk a little bit here now about FTD genetics. There are three major genes that we think about as, and changes in these genes as causative of FTD. This is C9 open reading frame 72, or C9orf72, progranulin, shortened as GRN, and MAPT. So those are the three major genes. There are some others, but these are the three major ones that we think of as if there is a genetic cause, a single gene change causing FTD. These are the main three. And the pattern of inheritance, just so these words are there, is autosomal dominant. So that means that if you inherit one of these genes, that you only need one change to manifest the symptoms. The other part is that it's nearly 100% penetrant. So that means that it is thought that if a person who is carrying a gene change lives long enough, that there will likely be FTD symptoms exhibited during life at some point. However, there is a wide range of the age of onset and the symptoms which develop even within a family. So that can be very tricky to navigate, and that can also be hopeful in some ways in that it's not clear what exactly would happen over the course of a lifetime, and there may be opportunities for intervention. So one way to think about this is, while there is a larger risk than with Alzheimer's disease that there is a single gene change causing FTD, the majority of people who have FTD do not have FTD because of a single gene variant. So most of the time, it is what we call sporadic. So most of the time, a change in one of those three genes is not found. One reason why we think about these specific genes is that if one of these gene changes is found, then we can actually identify what that protein tangle is. So C9 open reading frame 72 and progranulin, those gene changes cause accumulation of TDP43. And the MAPT gene changes cause accumulation of tau. So when we have the disease modifying therapy, that some of it may target specifically the tau accumulation or target specifically the TDP43 accumulation, that may be an important time to know, one way of figuring out what the exact protein tangle is, if we don't have a way to do that by analyzing blood or spinal fluid or a specific type of brain scan, would be by determining whether there is a gene change causing the disease. So we are continually learning more about FTD, and this is in thanks to many of you. There is something called the All FTD Consortium across the United States, creating a research-ready network of people with FTD, family members, and care centers. And so some of the things that you might be hearing about soon, or perhaps have already heard about, are these new discoveries that come up from the research. So there is a biomarker, something that we can measure, called neurofilament light chain. It was first identified in spinal fluid, but now they've improved the assays, and in the research side, we can measure this in blood, and we can see that if there's a change in the amount of neurofilament light change, that predicts that there will be a change in symptoms. So this can come up, you know, when might there be when might the progression occur? There may be more answers in the future from a biomarker such as NFL. Also, there has been some findings that for individuals who are at risk of having FTD due to a gene change, it seems as though having an active lifestyle may mitigate if there is some atrophy. There is not as much cognitive change as you might expect with the degree of atrophy if there's a very active lifestyle. So there are plenty of ways that we can make inroads here that don't involve just medications. And that's what we're continually learning. This consortium also seeks to connect participants to advocacy groups and support services and research opportunities, and you'll be hearing about some of this going forward. One thing that the consortium is seeking to do is to work closely with drug companies to be very careful about which studies are performed on whom. I had mentioned at the beginning the rarity of this disease, and thus having, for example, a gene change causing this disease is even more rare. And there is a big um, uh, push to try to ensure that any information that drug companies learn are then shared back to the community, the FTD community. So there's a lot of excitement and promise and hope, but we also want to be cautious about moving forward carefully. But I'm so pleased to have so many of you here today interested in learning more, and I'm happy to answer any questions.